saw an Instagram reel recently that I really liked. It illustrated generational trauma and how it's passed down until one kid is born that is born to feel all the feelings.
Welcome to Coffee Break, where we invite you to walk on the path of self-discovery with us. I'm Fatima, joined by my co-hosts, Liz and Grace. 3 women from different walks of life, united by our passion for purposeful living, authentic connection, and service to others. We recognize that the journey of self-discovery is not a solitary one. You are not meant to walk on this path alone. We need each other in this fast-paced world. Through our vulnerable conversations, we explore life's challenges and provide hope and solutions. We invite you to grab a cup of coffee and take a break with us. Today, we're talking about something we all feel and we've experienced since the pandemic, and that's loneliness and isolation. Well, today we're going to be talking about families. And in preparation for this podcast, we realized that we actually had a lot of similarities due to our cultures. And one of the similarities was that we were parentified children who were trying to navigate the taboo around emotional and mental health in our families and our communities. What do you do when your family doesn't foster a sense of belonging? The very first place where you learn who you are, and if you feel like you don't fit in, how does that impact the rest of your life? And so that's what our conversation is going to be about today. And I just want you all to, sit back, relax, take a woosah. Some of these things that we're going to talk about might be triggering. We've done a lot of work to get to a certain place, but we can all say we haven't arrived. We can't wait to hear your questions and your comments. And as always, we just want to let you know that this is our journey. This is what we did. We know that everybody has their own journey, and we're not telling you what to do with your family. We're just sharing our stories and the lessons that we learned from our journey. We would love for you to join us on our Facebook group so that we can continue to support you after this episode at the Nexus Experience. So I use this word parentified, and I just want to make sure, I have a background as a teacher. I can't help myself. Dr. Nicole LaPera says, parentification is when we become a little adult, when our parents look to us as a peer who can give them emotional support. That sets us up for high anxiety and hyper independence, and it can show up differently for everyone. So we're going to have a conversation about that as well. So I'm joined here by my podcast mates, Liz and Grace. And, it's hard for us to talk about this, to be honest, because when you are playing an emotional support role for your family, when you're looked to fulfill certain responsibilities and obligations, there's a loyalty there. And so we believe that this conversation is necessary, and we're willing to share some of our stories because we think that it will help. All right, well, I'm going to get myself out of the way because I'm so interested in hearing Liz's story, and will we have points of connection and will we have differences?
One thing I did want to mention is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Our parents work so hard to make sure there's food on the table, that we have a roof over our heads, survival, so physiological needs. And then our parents continued that in making sure that we are surviving, that we're safe. I believe the second level in the hierarchy is safety. And for people who don't know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's basically how there's levels to what needs that you satisfy before you can self-actualize. So be the fullest version of yourself.
And I do recognize that it's a luxury to be able to even think about this stuff. Mm-hmm. Our parents' generation, there was a reason why they didn't have space for feelings and emotions, because it was a really difficult time, and they were just focused on doing what they needed to do. So it is a luxury, but since we are in a place where we can, I think creating those spaces of love and belonging is an opportunity. And I think that's why they're saying, like, this is a new wave, a new era of parenting, like gentle parenting, Were you about to say something, Fatima?
No, I was just going to agree. And maybe for my generation as a luxury, for you all, it becomes like almost an expectation. And then for maybe Gen Z, it's just the way it is. You know, so with every generation, the iteration, it becomes more and more a part of the culture and what we expect. And we're just going to continue to move up.
So I'll share a little bit about my background and the dynamics in my family while growing up. So initially, there was this expectation that I would be born a boy, which is something that's deeply rooted in traditional Korean culture, where having a boy as the first child is considered a very big blessing. And that's because boys are seen as inherently more valuable because they are the ones to continue on the family name. So when I defied that expectation and came into this world as a girl, there was some expectation around me to adopt characteristics that are typically seen as more masculine, such as suppressing my emotions. And so because of that, I felt trapped at times and unable to express my true self because I felt there wasn't really space for me to do that. And so facing those challenges along with the birth of my sister, my younger sister, who was completely different from me and just more divergent of my family's expectations and didn't comply to fitting into any box. You know, with that, my family struggled to understand and guide her, which led to turning to me for answers. And so that put me into a little bit more of a parenting role and, versus being solely her sister. So with all of that experience left me feeling a bit lost and unsure of big parts of my identity. And a large part of myself was just fulfilling a certain role in my family's dynamic. So yeah, it wasn't until later that I began to recognize the need to define who I am more clearly and to create that space for myself.
I can imagine how discordant that could be because you were fulfilling a role that was established for you before you even were born. So you didn't even have a chance to have an identity. And it wasn't acknowledged. Everybody just followed suit. And then on top of that, not only were you not allowed to really express and form your own identity, you were parentified on top of that and expected to somehow do a job that your parents were struggling to do. And I think that I can definitely identify. It wasn't until I'm hearing your story that I could say that my parents kept trying to have kids because they wanted a boy. And I was the oldest girl, and I was kind of put in that substitute role, not to the degree of it sounds like that happened in your family, but it's definitely resonating with me.
Yeah, I mean, my parents tried 4 times to have a boy. I'm not even kidding. They told me that they tried. They got a girl for their first, and then their second, and then their third. And then they were so sure that they're like, okay, 3 is a handful. Like, let's stop here. And then they finally had a boy on their 4th attempt. And I remember my dad being like so happy that they were able to have a boy. And I notice a lot of people resonate with the story of having to take care of your siblings, especially being like the oldest or one of the older siblings. I feel like our parents' generation, being immigrants, had to really start over from scratch. And my parents, essentially, when they came from Korea, they were working odd jobs and trying to make the American dream, essentially. And I think they did what it took to try to provide some sort of stability for their kids. And that leads to the kids being home alone. I kind of took on like an older sibling role. And a lot of times, like even when I would go grocery shopping with my siblings or something like that, people would ask me, is that your son? And I was like, do I look like that could be my son?
Similar. I had similar experiences.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a similar experience of kind of suppressing my needs and just doing what it takes to be the responsible one, putting my emotions and needs on the back burner. And something I wanted to ask you guys is, do you relate to emotions being a taboo in your culture, in your household? Because that was definitely a big thing for mine. My parents grew up in the generation where their parents were in the war. And so they grew up in very like strict households, and emotions were not a thing. Mental health was not a thing, because it was a time period of toughen up. Emotions and mental health were seen as weakness, and it was not seen as a thing to be acknowledged. And it was a source of a lot of shame. So I'm curious if you guys had similar experiences.
Well, I'll just talk about in our culture, yes. I will say that it's so ironic that that war that you're talking about, what it was over here was called the Great Depression after that war. And so they were actually economically depressed, but we had a generation of depressed people, but they were called the silent generation because they just withdrew into themselves. And that silent generation raised the baby boomers. So our parents definitely, there was no talk of mental illness. They didn't know why their parents were moody, withdrawn. I will say that our parents, all of us sitting at the table, I feel like they did the best that they could because they were doing a lot of the first in their generation. And when you were doing the first, there's a lot of survival. You're just scrapping. You don't have time to, or the luxury to think about mental health or the luxury to think about emotional health.
Right.
But that does not negate that lack of presence in the home where it's okay to feel your emotions and talk about your needs and wants. It doesn't negate that doesn't still hurt. It still doesn't impact us. It still doesn't take away the fact that it caused trauma. Mm-hmm. So I think, the balanced way to look at it is, yes, this is what happened. Have grace and mercy for our families and for our parents, but not take away from what we experienced. And so definitely in my culture, even to this day, people will give mouth service to therapy in my generation and above, but it's really the younger generation that actually believes in it and will talk openly about it. And I would say mostly women, though. It still hasn't spread, I would say, as much to younger African-American boys and men. So, yeah, we definitely have that in common.
Just for our audience, what generation are you part of, Fatima?
Oh, yeah, I'm Generation X. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I think that's definitely how trauma is passed down, right? So when we talk about generational trauma, I think it starts with somebody suppressing a lot of emotions, or when something traumatic happens, instead of processing that event. And then you raise your kids, but you haven't faced this trauma that you're feeling. And so you don't know how to deal with these emotions that are coming out, whether you're angry all the time or you're withdrawing or whatever it might be. And then your kids take on that pain, and then they pass it down, and it continues and continues. And I saw an Instagram reel recently that I really liked. It essentially illustrated generational trauma and how it's passed down until one kid is born that is born to feel all the feelings. Mm-hmm. And that's where the trauma ends, because you finally have someone who's willing to acknowledge the pain. And I feel like to even start the healing process, you have to acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah, that is so true. When I think about my daughter who passed away at 25, that really hit our family hard. And so I read this book, I can't think of the title right now, about grief, and it says that in families where people don't face their trauma and pain, you can always trace the thread to the trauma before. So my daughter died at 25. It hit us hard, and because we've made some strides as a family towards healing a little bit, we were able to deal with it. But I also had a sister who died when she was 25, and you trace that thread back, we didn't really deal with that death at all. One minute she was here, the next minute, I would say within weeks, we rarely talked about her again. You trace that to the generation before, there was a death that nobody talked about. And so, yes, there's acknowledged pain passed from generation to generation, but there's things that seem to happen in each generation that if we don't deal with, they just layer and layer and layer on top of each other. And so my story is a family that my parents were achievers. we were all proud of them as a family. We were like the Cosby family. I grew up with my father going through law school, my mother going through nursing school. Externally, we were doing really well. But they had years and years of trauma and generational things that hadn't been dealt with. And then, so we as children faced some things. And so once COVID happened, there were so many years of things that I had swept under the rug from my childhood, from my 2 marriages. I went through a divorce. Even though my career was at its peak, I was taking a lot of time from nurturing my family and dealing with my problems. So then when everything halted and my family moved in, I was able to see, oh my goodness, there's so much work that I need to do with my family. And a lesson I learned from my older daughter is I knew she was living fast and hard. I knew she wasn't going to live long. And so one good thing about COVID is it helped me to slow down because I didn't want to regret if something happened to her. I wanted to feel like I did everything that I could. And so with COVID, I was able to stop and really focus on her. Well, I had started before COVID, but certainly. So when she did pass away, I could lay my head on the pillow and feel like I was the person who saw the generational curses, and I raised my hand to be the one to to heal our family. And so there's still a lot more to be worked on in our family, but I feel like with my children, I'm trying my best to face the pain, to advocate and be an example of going to therapy. As I learn things, share it with them. But I think the thing that I do the most that I'm proud of is they see me turning to God. They see how I focus on God to get through the hard times. And I trust in God that He has a plan and that I was put here for a reason. And I'm convicted about that reason and my purpose. So even though it's tough, I'm grateful that He gave me the sensitivity and He gave me the experiences that I've had, because I'm not saying I'm the only person in my family focused on healing. I'm just talking about my individual journey. I feel like that's what I'm leaving behind.
I mean, I feel like I could really see that. And ever since I met you, I feel like you have this light to you that just is contagious. And I feel like your kids most definitely feel that from you.
Thank you.
You've set such an example and are such an inspiration. And you took something incredibly painful and incredibly difficult, and you chose to, become stronger for it and stronger for your kids, which is not an easy thing to do at all.
And I really, because I've spent a little bit of time with Fatima, and especially your youngest, right? And every time I see her, I am blessed just from witnessing, especially your youngest, when I see her, because people say in children, you can see what they're going through, all of the emotion, maybe everything they're going through at home or whatever. You can see it on their face very clearly, just their natural state. And after everything that Fatima went through last year, her whole family, and I look at her youngest just like being in the world, she has that light where a lot of people that I know or children that I know that have gone through traumatic experiences and so much pain, they carry a lot of that in just even in their physical body. And Fatima is just a testament of how much she knows that, and she's been aware and being able to raise your kids in a different light. I mean, with that light, choosing to do it a different way, giving that space for her kids to acknowledge their feelings, what they're going through. I think it really is evident in your children.
That's something that I really hope, like, if I were to decide to have kids, that I could turn it around and do it differently, I think the three of us were born as the children who are meant to feel the feelings.
Right.
Or, I wouldn't say that we're like Well, okay, I'll just speak for myself. I wouldn't say I'm an emotional person. I like to be more practical and logical and then considering the feelings too. But I don't just like move based on how I'm feeling all the time. But I do think I was born more sensitive. Like I'm sensitive to the feelings of others, and I'm very much like an empath. And so being born in my family meant picking up on the trauma and picking up, and maybe at that age I didn't recognize like what it was exactly, but I knew that something was wrong, something was broken. And I think you could see that as like a curse, but I think it's a gift to be able to, like you said, like turn around and change the spaces that you create. When you make your own home, when you have your own kids, you can make a different space and a safe space and a space that allows for emotion.
Well, for the audience, you said something that I would love for you to go a little bit deeper on. You said you kind of move from logic and pragmatism and emotions come second, but that you're sensitive. What to you is the difference between being sensitive and being emotional?
I guess I see being emotional as like more a negative connotation. Like when you say, oh, that person's really emotional, to me, it's a negative thing. But as I think about it, they're probably hand in hand, like being sensitive and being emotional. But I think it goes back to how I was raised as I'm processing this out loud. But like with my dad, for example, in the way that he raised us, emotions were pointless. And so anytime there was something that upset me and I got emotional, it would get shut down. And it would be pretty much that I was being illogical and that anything that I had to say didn't have value. But if I could present whatever was upsetting me in a very logical manner, without crying, without getting upset.
A PowerPoint presentation.
Bring a PowerPoint presentation. Then he would lend his ear. And so as you asked me that, I'm starting to think like, okay, maybe they're the same thing.
Yeah, I ask you because I have said that to people. I'm sensitive, but I'm not emotional. But because in my family, there was a negative connotation to being emotional. But now through, years of doing the work, I realize that the very people who don't want to honor and look at emotions are really the most emotional people. Once you allow yourself to feel those emotions, I don't believe I'm that naturally very emotional because I go through how I feel and I come out on the other side as opposed to someone who won't acknowledge that there is an emotion. So yes, I've said before, I'm sensitive, not emotional, but also let's just explore think about the people in your life who look down at emotions and think about how much they really live their lives based off of emotions that they don't express, and primarily coming from fear,
Right.
So. And, this podcast, we're talking about families because we know that in order for us to feel like we belong, to know that we have a place in the world, we want to do the work with our families. Finding a place and providing a space for ourselves and our families is really important.
Right. And the way to do that, I think, are boundaries. There's this quote that I saw that said, boundaries aren't meant to keep things and people out of your life, but it's meant to keep them in your life. So I think boundaries are really healthy. And I feel like most people know what boundaries are at this point, but just in case you don't, they're essentially...
They are the physical, mental, emotional guards we put in place to make sure that we have healthy relationships with others.
I love that definition, Liz. How do you make sure you do that in your family?
In my experience with my family, just learning even how to communicate my boundaries was a game changer. Even the concept of boundaries doesn't exist in my parents' generation. So I didn't ever learn how to communicate needs or having boundaries. So there was a kind of tension when I first started doing this in my own family. Like, hey, I can't help you right now. I'm working, even though I'm at home. And they didn't have any huge objection to it. They just accepted it as it is. They would wait until I'm done working before asking me for something. And I realized it was just as simple as communicating what I needed. instead of just suffering in silence. Why am I needed every 5 seconds of the day? So that was a simple thing, but something that it took a lot of practice for me.
Yeah, I love how you said communicating your needs to set the boundaries. And I'm like your mom. I remember the first time one of my daughters was like, my second oldest, she was like, Mom, respect my boundaries. I didn't even know what she meant by that because I didn't grow up with boundaries. I didn't I didn't raise them with boundaries. So I remember, I think she was in high school. That was the first time, that was maybe, 5 or 10 years ago. I'm hearing this big concept of boundaries. And now I understand the importance of them, but I'm still working on what are my boundaries. And your boundaries, protect your needs. And so then you have to be clear on what your needs are. And that's what I'm working on right now. And so, I didn't grow up with that word at all. I didn't raise my kids with that word at all. And so I'm learning a lot from the younger generation about how important it is. What about you, Grace?
I think a boundary that I'm working on is towards emotional dumping, which is essentially when somebody doesn't check in on where you're at mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and they just like, as soon as they start talking to you, just start like dumping all their trauma and their emotions and everything that they're going through. And I'm just like, I can't do this right now. But realizing that that's okay, making it clear when I need that space, and then making it clear when, okay, I'm in a place where I can listen and I can talk.
Yeah, so what's most important is we're not going to all have the same boundaries, but it's understanding what your needs are, knowing what boundaries need to be in place. And you might have to practice with it. You might not be sure at first. Try this. It might not work for you. Try something else. And then communicating them and keeping relationship with people who honor those boundaries and maybe having some limitations on people who don't. Because if you put up a boundary and someone disrespects it over and over again, then to me that's a clear sign that maybe that's someone who doesn't deserve access as much as they did before. Yeah. So this has been a great exploration, and we just want to leave you all today with some of our lessons that we've learned. We've already talked about boundaries, but we have some lessons and solutions that we hope will help you as you journey, if this is something that you deal with. Some people have decided, you know what, I'm creating a brand new family. And then some people are blessed to be very happy with their families. And then some of you are like us, where we've come from cultures and communities where we're on a spectrum. We definitely want to stay involved with our families, but we know that there's a lot of healing. So, Liz, what would you like to leave them with as far as solutions?
I would say one solution that has really impacted me in this last year is giving myself permission to put myself first, or to prioritize my well-being and my journey of growth, healing. And not that I have to push my family to the side or neglect them, but just making sure that I'm attending to myself so that I can be there for my family as my best self. And that has been a big lesson for me this year.
Mm-hmm. I think mine is, we can only focus on what we can control, and then anything outside of that we need to release. And I resonate with what you said. And I always think of the analogy of when you're flying on a plane and they're telling you, like, when the air masks come off, put yours on first and then put it on your kid or your whoever. And I feel like that is so applicable, because ultimately, if you don't help yourself first and if you don't make sure you're good, you can't help anybody. So I think you can be an agent of change and healing for your family, but you need to make sure that you're good first.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And I think for me, we don't mean to do that to our families, but we've learned a lot of gaslighting. Things will happen and it's the elephant in the room, or it's swept up under the rug. So recently I've given myself permission to tell myself the truth and to be open to myself about the truth, even if nobody in my family believes me or acknowledges it. It was so helpful for me to say, this is my truth. The other thing is, when we're talking about focusing on what we can control, as Grace said, we can only be accountable for the boundaries and for the core values and the things that we've set forth for ourselves. And so being an older sister, when I made changes or discovered things, sometimes I was really I wanted to force everybody to be on board with it. And what I've learned is you can only be accountable for yourself. You can't hold other people accountable. And so the biggest lesson, though, is that with all that my family has gone through, with everything that has historically happened to the people of my culture, I end the day with gratitude. I begin the day with gratitude. I'm very grateful for my family. I'm very grateful for my parents and everything that they set forth as an example for us, all of the successes that they had, all of the sacrifices that they made. And so I just invite you to think about 3 things that you're grateful for that you learned or gained from your family of origin. Well, we hope that the solutions and the call to action that we shared with you for today really makes a difference for you. And we want to hear your thoughts and continue to support and encourage you. So please join us on our Facebook group at the Nexus Experience. We also have our Unfiltered episode where we went out and talked to some folks about their family of origin. You can check that out on our Instagram at the Nexus Experience as well as TikTok. And join us next week where we're going to talk more about relationships and how important they are to combating loneliness and isolation. We look forward to chatting with you next week.